Hi, welcome back. In today's session, let's understand how to handle errors in Mulesoft. We'll see how to use on-error propagate and on-error continue components in Mulesoft. And also we'll try to create global error handlers and add all the generic errors there. And also we'll see how to handle errors in Triscope. Before going into negative workflows, let's see how the success workflows will be. The primary workflow or the main workflow will get the request, and the flow reference will call the inner flow where there is a request. Once the request is successful, then the success response will be passed to the next flow. That's the primary flow, and the same success response will be returned back to the user. I have few example APIs which are working fine in success workflow. Let's hit this get train API, which is getting train information for train number 200. There are no trains. It basically gets a train information for the train number given. Post train API, which post the train information. Post is action, train is the resource, and we have a train information in the request body, and all these information will be written to the database. These are the train information, and when it's success, the data will be written to the database. Now it's 201. The train entry is created in the database. Let's go and check. Yes, we are getting the response back. The train number 20, Bangalore to Chennai is added. And this is a main flow. We have a API kit router which is routing to post trains API. Here we have a insert query which is inserting the train information, and at the end we are building a payload, right? After the successful workflow, we are building the payload, but we are not getting the payload back. Let's see. There is a mistake actually. For success response, we should get the payload, not error description, right? So error description should be there in the error response. When we get the errors, we should get the error response, error description, or payload maybe. But for now, let's say error description. And for success workflow, we should get the payload, because for success, we are building the custom payload, right? We should get that. Let's hit the get train because we have already written to the DB. Now we are getting the train information because previously we have written the train number 20. So we are getting back the same response. Let's try some random value. There are no records for this train number. Let's change to different train number and try to write. Now we are getting the success response back. Previously it was response body was empty. Now the entry is created successfully. We are getting the payload that we are building, right? In the post trains, after inserting the details to the database, we are building the payload and we are getting the same response back because it's a success workflow, right? In case of success, we are getting the payload that we are building in the post trains workflow. So let's clear. And this is a success workflow. So what if we want to create some negative workflow? Let's not give any train information. There is no train, so what to write? So we are getting unsupported media type. Let's see what is the exception in the console. API kit unsupported media type, right? We are getting an exception. And since this API is created by importing the API specification, there are already error handlers by default handling the errors related to API kit router. So here we can see that API kit unsupported media type exception is already handled. In error handling section, we can see that there are many on-error propagate components, and we have one for unsupported media also. And here we are building the payload for unsupported media type, but we are not getting that payload. We are only getting the error description because again it's the same issue. In the listener response, we are saying that in case of error, just give the error description. So let's say give the payload that we are building for that particular error, so that we can build the custom error payload, and we can give the user the same payload. So let's deploy, and now let's clear the console and run the API again. This time we should get the payload properly. Yes, now we are getting the payload that we are building specifically for this error type, unsupported media type. Let's go back and check. Yes, here we have unsupported media type. This is the exact payload that I am getting back. So make sure what you are expecting and what you have set in the listener response tab matches, so that you can expect the proper response in the response body. Right? Yeah, as I said, these are auto-generated from when we imported the API specifications. So by default, there are many error handlers. So on error propagate, there are error handlers in API Kit console and also main flow. So let's create a global error handler and move all these generic errors to one place. Let's create a Mule configuration and let's name the file as global error handler. Now the global error handler file is created, the configuration file is created. So let's drag and drop the error handler and place all the generic error components here. This is a global error handler, and we can go to the main workflow where we have the auto-generated errors, and these are very generic errors. So let's go to XML and copy all the on error propagate components. Let's copy everything that is inside error handler. Till here we can cut, save it, and let's see what's there in the message flow. In the main flow we can see that there is nothing, right? Because we have copied everything from there. So let's come to this global error handler file and place all these on error propagate components inside this error handler. So we can drag and drop and place those components, and it's easy to copy and paste, right? So now we can see that all the generic errors are here. So now this file is clean. We don't see much of data. This API kit not found is already there in the global error handler because it was there in main flow as well. So let's delete it. And there is one more thing. Now we have created the global error handler and we have to define that this is a default error handler. Let's define the configuration saying this is a default error handler. If the error is not handled, by default it comes to the global error handler. This specifies the defaults basically. We have a default error handler called global error handler. Let's save it. Since this demo project is imported from the API specification, we have to specify the error handler reference, global error handler reference. Otherwise, it may throw you null pointer exception because it expects some exception listener. If the flow is manually created, you don't have to give the reference. If you don't give the global error handler reference also, it works. In case of exception, by default, it goes to the global error handlers. Since this is from API Kit API specification, we have to specify it explicitly. Now it's deployed. Let's clear and test and cross verify that after moving to global error handler, it's working fine or not. all the error handling sections are empty. The main flow is referring to global error handler. Let's hit the service and we are getting unsupported media type and resource not found when there is a wrong URL given. Trains is the right resource. Let's try again. And these are working as expected. And previously, whatever was there in the main flow, we have moved it to the global error handler and referencing it from the main flow. Right? And now we are getting the errors as expected. Now let's create some unique error from this flow. Let's modify the SQL query. Instead of insert keyword, let's add some random word and let's try to create some error, some exception, and let's see how to handle that custom exception. Now the application is deployed. Let's clear the console and run the API and let's see what exception we get. It's still deploying. Let's wait. Yes, now let's test. We are getting the request body what we are passing with 500 error. So let's see what is the exception that we are getting. We are getting DB bad syntax, bad SQL syntax exception, right? Because insert is a keyword that is expected, but we have a bad syntax. So this is an exception which is not handled anywhere. And also in the response tab, yeah, this is the error. In the response tab, if we remember, we had a payload. Since we have not handled this exception, this error type DB bad SQL syntax, there is nothing in the error handling. So by default, it's giving the request payload what we are passing in the response as well. But it's a 500 error status. Let's drag and drop the on error propagate and give the error type. We have copied and given the same DB bad syntax error. So let's try to build custom payload. Say this is an exception handled in the flow. This time we are handling the exception in the flow itself, post train flow itself. We are trying to catch the exception and building the custom payload. So better we'll use the transform message so that it will be, we can give the response in JSON and we can match the success payload as well. In success workflow, we have this payload. Let's modify the same and get the error payload as well. So it will match the success response. Bad syntax. We are catching the exception, the custom exception that we are getting from the because of insert keyword and catching it here and building the custom payload. Now we should be able to get the custom payload. Yes, as expected, we are getting the payload that we are building here, right? And 500 is the error status code. Right? What if we want to define some different error status code? If we don't want 500 and we want 501 for this particular type of exception, we can do that as well. We can set the HTTP status variable. We are catching the exception and building the payload, error response payload, and also error HTTP status code. Okay, let's set the variable HTTP status code to 501. Let's save it. And where is this HTTP status code variable is used? We have set the payload and let's see where exactly this HTTP status code is used. If we go to listener and the response tab and check what's the status code is referring to, the error status code is referring to HTTP status variable, not status code, right? we will still get 500 because we made a mistake. We have given the variable name wrong. It should be HTTP status, not HTTP status code. HTTP status. This way we can override the HTTP status to the status code that we want. If you want to customize the status code and give the status code of your choice, you can do that. We have the HTTP status variable is overridden to 501 and the same is returned and displayed to user. We have changed the 500 to 501 and also by default it was 500 and now it's 501 because we are catching the exception and giving the custom HTTP status and payload, right? Now we have used on error propagate. So as of now we have handled the error in the child flow itself, right? So let's rename this properly. So it will be easy to understand what is exactly happening in this transfer message. We are building the error payload. We are building the error payload and setting the status in the child flow, right? The flow specific to post trends. So let's copy the same details, same variable and the transfer message and use it in the main flow. Let's try to handle the same error in both primary workflow, the parent workflow and also in child. Let's see what happens. Let's remove the reference because if we have the reference we cannot add the error components. So now there is nothing in the error handling section of main flow, right? So let's drag and drop on error continue. And in this, let's add the same details. Let's try to set the HTTP status code and also custom payload in the main flow as well. We have copied the details from the inner flow. So let's use the same in the parent flow as well. Inside on error continue, let's paste whatever we have copied from the inner flow, that's post trend flow. Now on error continue is having the same details. We are setting the status, but let's modify the error payload. This error is from main flow. Let's save it and run. Now we are trying to handle the same error in both the places, from primary flow and also inner flow. Let's see which one will be given priority. Let it get deployed. It's deployed. Let's run the workflow and see what payload we get. We are getting the payload that is built from main flow. So the priority will be given to the main flow, right? But we are getting the 501. We are using on error continue, but we are getting 501. I was expecting it should be success because we want to continue. So it should send a success response, but that is not working as expected. We are getting 501. That is because we are setting the error code, right? We are overriding the HTTP status code. In the success flow also, in the success response, if we see the status code, it's getting the value from HTTP status again, right? We are overriding that HTTP status. That's why whatever we are overriding to 501, that is getting used. So let's remove this variable where we are manually setting it, right? So let's remove that variable from both parent and also inner flow. Let's deploy. It's deployed. Now it's giving success response. That is because this on error continue, the on error continue that we have in the main flow is given priority. On error continue means it will continue to next level. So it's a success workflow. That's why it's giving 200 success by default. Previously we have overridden, that's why it was giving 501 because we manually overriding the HTTP status codes. Let's try to put on error propagate here as well and see what happens. In on error continue, we were getting 200 success, right? So let's replace it with on error propagate. Now we have on error propagate in both primary and also inner flow. And we are handling the same exception. Let's see which one will be again it will be the parent workflow, but let's see how on error propagate will work. Because on error propagate will propagate the error to next level, right? It's deployed. Now we should get 500. Yes, we are getting 500. When we have used on error continue, we were getting 200 response code, right? Now when we change it to on error propagate, it's propagating the error. That's why we are getting the error code, 500 error code. But the parent flow will be given priority. When there is nothing handled in the parent flow, it will go to the global error handler. And let's in this okay, if we observe this on error propagate, we can see nothing is there in the type. That means it can handle any type of error. When it's empty, that means it can handle any type of error. We should basically place this at the end when we have multiple error handling components, because it's kind of default flow. It handles everything. It can be HTTP not found, API kit errors, bad request, or anything. When we don't specify the type, it handles everything. Let's check that. Let's use rise error to rise a custom error. We have drag and drop that rise error, and here we can specify the type. Type you can give custom : error. You can give some random error description. Now we are trying to rise an error, custom error, and let's try to handle it. Sorry, let's not handle it and see what happens. We are getting custom error, right? We are getting custom error from this post trains flow, and it's throwing this error back to the main flow. And in main flow, there is nothing specified in the type, right? Let's go to the main flow, and if we check the on error propagate, there is nothing specified. So whatever the exception you get, that will be handled when you don't specify the type. So let's use on error propagate and specify the type here. Now we have two on error propagate. One is empty, so it can accept anything, and one is accepting custom error. So let's see which one will be given priority. So we should move the custom error, the specific error above, otherwise any will be given priority, right? So let's move the custom error above, and at the end we will have a default one. Default means where we don't specify any type. So any error can come here, and the payload will be built for that generic error. Let's change this error and message also. It's a generic error because we have not specified the error type. Generic error and generic message it is. This is an on error propagate to handle the custom error, the specific custom error, nothing else. It handles only the custom error. If you have something else, this will be skipped and will go to the on error propagate below, which is a default error handler. Now we are raising a custom error, and in the main flow we are handling the custom error, and also there is a default on error propagate. Let's see. Since we are handling the custom error, we should get the custom error. Yes. Since we have a specific error handler, it's coming to the error will be raised from the post trains workflow. Let's change it to some random value. Okay, now we are handling the custom error, right, in the main flow. Since it's a custom error, it's not identified because no one is raising that error, right? In this application, no one is raising that custom error. So it is not identifying that type. So let's change it to the famous one, HTTP not found. Now we are raising a random error. Now it should go to the default one where we have a generic error. It's a generic and default on error propagate because there is nothing specified in the type. It's empty. You can specify any also. Even in that case, it accepts. We have not found, which is generic, and any is also a generic. So we can actually move this to global error handler. So let's copy this and move this to global error handler. We have raised a custom error. Any type of exception or error you get, you can just use that type and you can start handling that the way you want. You can use on error propagate if you want to propagate the error to next level. You can use on error continue if you want to propagate the success to next level. Let's paste the generic errors to global error handler. Now we can see that at the end we have HTTP not found and also empty. You can specify any also here, which acts same way. Generic error handler is there and custom error. Let's change it back to custom error. Let's change. Let's raise custom error only. Let's deploy it and see what we get. When we get the custom error, we should get the custom error again because it's getting handled in the global error handler. If we get any exception which is not handled in the global error handler, that goes to the last error component, which is generic component. And now let's take another workflow to understand more about on error continue. We have get trains workflow, which is giving us the train information. There is a DB call here, which is getting the trains from the database. Right? Let's check for 20. We are getting the train information. So this is an API which is giving the train information. There is a DB call to get the train information. Let's try to raise an error from here. We are getting some arrow marks, unnecessary arrow marks. So to fix this problem, we can cut everything and paste it back. Now the arrows are removed. I don't know why we get that error. Oh, sorry, the arrow marks. But if you cut and paste it again, it works fine. Now we have the raise error component. You can raise the error, again the custom error from here, and give some random description, test error message or something. And let's try to raise an error from get train API as well and see, because we don't have any error handling components here. All the error handling sections are empty. This is a new flow in the same application. We have a global error handler also. Now we are getting the test error message. This is an error description. It's again the same problem in the response tab, listener response tab. Let's see what is there in the error response body. Yes, we have a error description. Let's change it to payload. Even if we don't refer to global error handler, as soon as we get the exception, and also if that exception is handled in the global error handler, we should get the proper payload. Yes, we are getting the proper payload, right? Even though it's not handled here, it's not handled anywhere in this file, in these workflows. And when we get the rise error exception, it's going to the global error handler, and it's giving us it's building the payload, and in the listener response tab where we are referring to the payload, right, it's giving us the payload. You can see that error handling section is empty. And we are also not referencing to global error handler. Even if we don't refer to it, by default global error handler will handle the exceptions. If the maybe if the exceptions are defined there, it will be handled. Let's create one more flow and see how on error continue works in this case when we have multiple flows. Let's add logger to the flow where we're querying the table, and also let's add the logger to flow 2 as well. And let's try to build some payload in the flow 2 as well. Let's say message from flow 2. Let's rename it properly. Building payload, building response. Now we have created a new flow. This is, let's say we are inside flow 2, and this logger is after raising an error, right? Let's say after error. Let's use flow reference and call flow 2 as well. First flow reference is to call the DB workflows, and the second one to call the flow 2. There are two flows now. Listener gets the input and calls the DB and try to get the train information, and next is a flow 2. And in the flow 1 itself we are getting the exception, right? We are getting the custom error. And let's try to handle that error in the error handling section. So let's try to handle in the inner flow itself. Let's try to continue. That means this flow will send the success to next level. Let's handle custom error. Let's try to add some payload here as well. Let's add some message saying this payload is from the error handler. Now we are getting the custom error and handling it and building the custom payload. Let's say this is the message. We are getting the custom error and handling it in the error handling section and building a custom payload. So now let's see what we will get. We are getting the flow to and success response. We can clearly see that we are getting the exception, and also there is only flow to in the log message. We don't have this after rise error, right? We have in flow to only. That means this flow where there is a custom error that is handled in the error handling section, it's building the payload and it's going back to main flow, right? It's going back to main flow as a success to flow to, right? That's why it's printing only the log message from flow to, and the payload is also from flow to, and at the end it's giving 200 success with payload from flow to. It's not going to logger or transform message, because in this on error continue is sending the success to next flow, not to next components, right? So let's try to use try block and see how differently it works. Or let's we have tried on error continue, right? Let's try with on error propagate also. So before going into try, let's see how on error propagate works with the same workflow. Let's try to handle the same custom error. This on error propagates works how it was working previously for other workflows. It's listening, coming to the flow 1, where it's raising the custom error, propagating the error back to main flow, and it should send the error 500 error and custom error. This is catching the exception, propagating it to main flow, and from there, since parent flow is not handling anything, it is going back to global error handler, which is a default one. And from here, since custom error is a specific error which is handled in the global error handler, so it's giving the error 500 with the payload from global error handler. So it's working similar to how it was working in different flows on error propagate. It just propagate the payload. So now let's try with try block. We have a rise error inside try, right? And this try, I am expecting it should send success to next component itself. We have a try, and in the error handling section, let's add the error details we already have. It's on error propagate. Let's change to on error continue, because on error propagate anyways will just propagate the error back to next level, right? So let's remove on error propagate, and now it's on error continue. So when we get the exception, it should continue, but where it should continue? It should continue to next level or the next component in the same flow. Now let's run. We are still getting success flow to message only, but the difference is we are getting the error, and in the log message we are seeing after rise error also. That is a log message from this train flow itself. After the exception, it's sending success to next component itself, because the error is limited to the try scope itself. So after the try scope, it's a success to next components. That's why we can see that after rise error is getting printed in the console. And next, in flow 2 also, it will be a success workflow. The only difference is to when we use a try block and continue, it will be a success to next component itself. Right? We handled it and we got a success response. Let's try the same thing with on-error propagate. We should get error with generic custom error, right? This message is from the global error handler. It's propagating the error not to next component, not to next flow. It's sending to next level. It's getting the error, propagating it to main flow, and from there it's going to global error handler. Since the custom error is handled, it's giving the exception back. Right? Now let's summarize. In success workflow, it's very clear. It gets the request, calls the flow, and once we get the request success response, it sends the success response back to user. And what happens if we don't have a handlers matching when we get the exception? The request gets the exception, but there are no handlers to handle the exception. In that case, the error will be propagating to the main flow, primary flow itself. On error continue scope always returns success response to next level, right? We have seen that we get 200 success response. And on error propagate will propagate error. When we have error handlers in both primary and inner flow, then the inner flow will also be executed and the primary flow will also be executed. But the payload that we built in inner flow will be overridden from primary flow. So whatever the payload we built from primary flow, that will be given to the user. When we don't have the error handlers in primary flow, so it's obvious whatever is handled in the inner flow will be given priority. And since here it's a continue, it will give success. And in try scope, it will handle the error. Since it's on error continue, it will give the success response to next component itself. So logger and transform message also will be executed in case of errors. So the exception will be remitted to the try block itself. Yes, that's it for today. Thank you.